Good evening. My name is Lance Murphy, and it is my pleasure to introduce Tony Kurdzuk from Canon USA. Before joining Canon, Tony spent most of his career as a photojournalist in New Jersey, where he was on staff at the Star Ledger for 19 years. In that time, he was awarded 2006 Northern Short Course Photographer of the Year. He won New Jersey Press Photographer of the Year 3 times and contributed to the Star Ledger's staff's 2005 Pulitzer Prize for breaking news. Tony is currently the Northeast Senior Pro Market Rep for Canon USA, providing direct support to photojournalists and the rest of the photo community through Canon Professional Services. Tony will be giving an overview of the Canon EOS RF full-frame mirrorless system with specific emphasis on the EOS R5 and R6. He will also be discussing the new C70 RF mount full-featured EOS cinema camera. Please put any questions or comments you have in the chat box, and we will try to get to them following Tony's presentation. Tony?
Thank you, Lance, and welcome. Thank you for attending my little dog and pony show tonight. We're going to talk primarily about the R5 and the R6. I put this presentation together called What's the Same and What's. It's primarily going to concentrate on the R5 and R6 because there's a lot of interest in those two cameras right now, especially in the photojournalism world. And I'm going to talk about how they're the same, how they're different, and some of the things that might help you decide to choose between the two, because there are a lot of people actually that are on the fence right now. So let's start with what's the same. I don't think that Canon has ever come out with two cameras at the same time that share so many features that really down the line are identical. These two cameras share the same frame rate, both in mechanical and electronic shutter. They share the same dual pixel AF autofocus system, which we'll talk about. They have the same technology behind that, so there's no difference in performance with the autofocus. They both have 5-axis in-body image stabilization, dual card slots, 120 frame per second OLEDs. So the refresh rate in the viewfinder is very fast, very responsive, and really good for following sports and fast action. All the control dials that you're used to on our DSLRs. So if you're coming over from something like, especially the 5D Mark III or 5D Mark IV, all of the buttons and dials and everything are going to be really intuitive for you, right where you expect them to be. Both have built-in Wi-Fi with FTP, which is really exciting for both cameras. So if you're a working photojournalist that sends to an FTP site regularly, both of these cameras will do FTP straight out of the camera. They both have focus bracketing, movie time lapse. They both do 10-bit 422 video with Canon log, zebras, and a whole bunch of other cool stuff. So just from this list alone, you can see that they really do share an awful lot of similarities. So before we really get into talking about the cameras themselves, as exciting as they are, what's really exciting about the new RF system is the lens mount. And we'll start with the mechanics. The big deal to start off with is the large diameter lens mount. The 54mm lens mount allows the optical engineers a lot of freedom in designing optics because there's a lot of room in there to fit some glass. The other thing is the short back focus distance. So we don't have that movable mirror in there, and the engineers can put the rear optics as close as they need to the sensor, which also helps in creating really high quality optics. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, is the high data rate. There's a new 12-pin connection set on this mount, 4 more than the EF mount. And those not only enable faster data rate between the lens and camera, which we're going to get into, but more kinds of data between the camera and lens, which moving forward in the RF system is going to become really important. So in terms of optics, the advantages of the lens mount, we talked about the larger diameter and the short back focus. All of the RF lenses across the board, even if they have an EF counterpart, are sharper optically than our previous lenses. Not having that mirror box in there and having that large diameter mount allows a lot of freedom to design these high quality optics. Then we've got really high specs on some of these lenses. So this one in particular, the RF 28 to 70 2.0. So this lens is a 2.0 all the way through the zoom range, a stop faster than any other lens in the class. And then you've got a more compact design. So if you compare something like the RF 24-105 to the EF version, it's considerably smaller. And this graphic here shows you the difference. That's an EOS R with the RF 24-105 compared to a 5D Mark IV with the EF 24-105, and you can see the considerable difference in size. So another thing is coordinated lens stabilization. So we now have in-body stabilization plus optical stabilization. So you combine that with the 12-pin high data rate contacts, plus the new CPU in the RF lenses that have their own gyro and acceleration sensors, combined with the Digic-X processor and the camera and everything that goes on between those two. We've got this high-speed data transfer that will allow up to 8 stops of coordinated in-body and in-lens stabilization when you're using an RF lens that has IS built into it. So think about hand-holding at a full second shutter speed and getting consistently sharp imagery is that good. So talking about the size of the lens mount, this is really important to compare the RF to some of our competitors, and the difference in size between compared to the full frame sensor. And so that larger lens mount I mentioned allows better optics, but because now we have in-body image stabilization and that sensor is actually moving around in that lens mount, it has more room to move in there. So that's part of the reason why we can get that combined 8 stops of IS. In addition, it can move around to a greater angle without cutting off the corners and causing vignetting when you have a system with a smaller lens mount. So when you have a EF or RF lens with image stabilization built into it, you don't get any control in the camera over the image stabilization. Everything is done through the switch on the lens. So if the lens has IS, whether it's EF or RF, turning the switch off on the lens will turn all of the image stabilization off on the whole system, which is really handy for video shooters if you're going from handheld to a tripod and you want to turn that IS off on the tripod, that one switch will do it. If you're using an EF or an RF lens that doesn't have image stabilization built into it, you now get a menu item that allows you to control the image stabilization, whether it's on or off in the body. And then if you're using an adapted lens, or for example, one of our cinema lenses with a PL mount that has a PL to RF adapter, you can actually input the focal length of the lens you're using manually so that the in-body stabilization matches up to the focal length of your lens. One of the other things that's really important with the new cameras is the new Digic-X processor, and the high data rate allows us to do digital lens optimizer in the camera all the time, even at 20 frames per second. So what DLO, we call it DLO, what that does is it optimizes the optics in the lens to correct for things that couldn't be done or couldn't be done practically in actual optics. So for example, diffraction correction, when you stop down any lens on a digital camera to say f11 or f22, you actually start to lose sharpness because of the way the three-dimensional sensor operates with the image moving through it. So we can apply this digital lens optimizer, including diffraction correction, peripheral illumination, things like that, to correct the image in real time, whether you're shooting raw JPEG, 20 frames per second. We can now do this for the first time because of the new processor technology. And both cameras have our new dual pixel AF2. What this means is that every on the sensor can be used focus detection, and this is phase detect autofocus. So you might remember in some older AF systems where you try and autofocus off the sensor and it sort of comes into focus and goes out and then comes back in and does some of this back and forth. Phase detect doesn't do that. Phase detect, as it's getting to the focus point, knows where that correct focus is and stops right at that point. And so with dual pixel AF2, we can now do that over the entire sensor, regardless of what metering, what AF mode you're in. So, for example, no matter how good you might be at tracking subjects and follow focus and all of that, if you're shooting fast moving action, you're going to get a scenario every now and then where your subject appears in the corner. And so with these cameras, even if you get a scenario like this where the subject is all the way off in the corner, these cameras will be able to maintain that full servo AF and keep that subject in focus. So combined with the processor and what we call now deep learning technology. So in the processor, we have thousands upon thousands of scenarios that the processor uses to compare what it's seeing through the lens with other scenarios to help it achieve correct focus. So with this deep learning technology, we get eye detect AF and face detect AF and head detect AF. So even if the subject is turned away from the camera and you're only getting a profile or even the back of their head, the camera will still recognize the shape of the human body and track just the head. You can also put the camera into animal priority, specifically for dogs, cats, and birds. So you get that same really high quality eye detection, head detection with those specific animals. It does work with others, but your mileage may vary. I can tell you it works incredibly well with birds. If you're a birding person, these cameras are amazing. So one of the new lenses we came out with recently are our new F11 super telephotos. One is an 800 millimeter and one is a 600 millimeter. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, who's ever going to use an F11 lens? I can tell you I've had one for a little while and I've been shooting with it, and it's amazing and it's a lot of fun, and F11 works. But what's really cool with these cameras now, because of the dual pixel AF, you can add a 2x teleconverter to these lenses, and you get full servo autofocus at f/22. And this is the first time this is available in any camera by any brand. And it really is incredible. It does work. So I mentioned some of the ergonomics and some of the buttons on these cameras. Like I said, you've got the rear control dial, you've got a top control dial, and then your main command dial. And then you've also got on the lenses the new control dial that allows you to program different functions into that. So literally at your fingertips, you've got 4 different ways of programming different functions that allow you to control shutter speed, aperture, ISO, focus mode, a whole host of things that you can change without taking the camera away from your eye. So all RF lenses have this new control ring on them, and the control ring is programmable in the camera to perform a host of different functions. So you can see some of them here: exposure compensation, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, flash compensation, AF mode, so forth. And the other thing that's neat is that all of these features have 2 modes of operation. You can set them up so that they're sort of hot all the time, so that when the camera is turned on, if you turn that control ring, that adjustment will be made. Or there's a fail-safe mode, so that if you have your finger halfway on the shutter, only that will activate the control ring. So that's sort of a way of keeping the control ring from inadvertently turned, and now all of a sudden you're shooting at 12,000 ISO in broad daylight. So that half press is a really cool feature. So back to the cameras. What else is the same? They share the same battery grip. So that's not new for Canon. We've have other cameras that share battery grips. Memory, there haven't been many. So the BG-R10 will fit either the R5 or the R6, and it gives you all of the features that you're used to in a add-on battery grip, like doubling your battery life and vertical controls and things like that. But on these cameras, they also add USB-C charging, which is really cool. So the R5. 45 megapixel sensor, native ISO of 51,200, and I can tell you that this camera in high ISOs, I'm talking 12,000 ISO, is really, really amazing. The noise level is so incredibly low, the detail is so high. It really is the best sensor Canon has ever made. Dual card slots, 8K recording, 5.76 million dot viewfinder. So this is the highest resolution viewfinder available in any Canon camera. And it really is absolutely crystal clear. We've gotten a lot of great feedback from people, especially people like wildlife and birder people that are looking through the viewfinder for hours at a time, that it actually is really comfortable and surprisingly easy to use. Dual pixel RAW, which we'll get into, 5 gigahertz built-in Wi-Fi. So the R5 uses 2.4 or 5 gigahertz to connect to Wi-Fi. And I mentioned that FTP capability, which is really key in the journalism world. Really rugged body, which we'll get into, and a 500,000 shutter cycle life. So if you're a 1DX user, you know, you're used to having 200,000 or 300,000 before you have to replace the shutter. The shutter is rated at 500,000, which is really amazing. You've got dual card slots. You've got one CF Express card slot that, if you're shooting CRAW plus JPEG, will give you a 240 frame buffer, which is pretty amazing considering this is a 45 megapixel camera. And then you've got a UHS-2 SD card slot that will give you a maximum 100 frame buffer. So you've got this really great buffer to work with for shooting sports or any kind of fast action, spot news, that kind of thing. So durability, I've had a lot of questions from people about how durable is the R5? How weather sealed is the R5? Can I depend on it? So the R5 has what we call 5 series weather sealing and durability. So if you're a 5D Mark III owner or a 5D Mark IV owner, that kind of weather sealing and durability, that kind of dependability when it comes to getting knocked around and being used in bad weather. It has an inner magnesium body that sort of holds all the electronics and guts together, but then it also has a full outer magnesium shell. So it's a dual magnesium body that's incredibly rugged. So what else is different about the R5? The R5 will accept our WFT R10A Wi-Fi transmitter. So this is a different kind of vertical grip. It is about the same size as the regular battery grip, maybe just an 1/8 of an inch taller, but it adds extended Wi-Fi range. It adds an Ethernet port. It adds multiple types of FTP. So you get FTP, FTPS, and SFTP. So if you're using a secure FTP server, this Wi-Fi transmitter will handle it. It takes a lot of how it works with the new Wi-Fi system out of the 1DX Mark III. The menu system for the Wi-Fi transmitter allows you to separate out your COM and function modes. So in other words, if you have multiple wireless connections that you can connect to, those can be programmed in separately compared to what you do on those Wi-Fi connections. So if you've got a single FTP server that you use all the time, you program that into the camera. When you come across a new Wi-Fi signal, all you have to do is program that new Wi-Fi signal and say, use my regular FTP connection, and it just works. It also allows you to do multiple types of functions over a Wi-Fi or Ethernet connection. So for example, if you're using the camera as a remote, you can have the camera send everything over FTP and also over that same connection, control the camera using EOS utilities. So you have a live view, you have a shutter button, you can set your AF points, you can change the ISO, the shutter speed, all of that EOS utility functionality comes along with FTP transmission, which is something we introduced in the 1DX Mark III and now carried over to the R5. You've got primary and secondary SSID switching. So if you're in a place where you've got potential Wi-Fi networks you can work with, you can program both of those in. One is a primary and one is the secondary. And if the primary signal goes out, the camera will automatically switch to that secondary connection, reconnect, and immediately start transmitting again. So that was something new with the 1DX Mark III. So again, a lot of those really advanced Wi-Fi features are being brought over into the R5. You also have our EOS network setting tool. So this is a PC and Mac utility that will allow you to configure network connections outside of the camera and then either copy them onto the card and then load them into the camera that way. Or if you're working and administrating a bunch of photographers at an event, you can set up all of the Wi-Fi and all of the FTP connections and then just email them the connection files, they load them into the cameras, and it just works. It's really cool. You get all the functions of a regular vertical grip, USB-C charging, but with this transmitter, you can decide whether you want to charge the battery for the transmitter or the battery for the camera first. So the two batteries are actually separated out in this device, where one powers the transmitter, one powers the camera. So I mentioned dual pixel RAW. This is something that came out with the 5D Mark IV. Not something that gets utilized a lot, but it actually has some really cool functions, and we've added to it now with the R5. So with the dual pixel AF and having that phase detect capability and knowing the depth where that focus point where the subject is, the camera can isolate the subject away from the background. So one of the new dual pixel RAW features is this portrait relighting function. So either in the camera using the in-camera RAW processing, or in our digital photo professional RAW conversion software, you can apply this portrait relighting, and you can simulate lighting coming from different directions, left, right, top, bottom. You can control the intensity of that light, and that's all because the camera can separate the subject away from the background. So by that same token, one of the other dual pixel RAW functions now is background clarity. So we added a clarity control to the 1DX Mark III, which is also in the R5 and R6. So if you're familiar with, say, like Adobe Camera Raw, that clarity slider that you use, this is very similar in terms of the effect it produces. But here with this dual pixel RAW, you can separate out the subject and apply that clarity to just the background, leaving the lighting on the subject the way it was when it was captured, which is really cool. And so it also maintains all of the dual pixel RAW functionality of the 5D Mark IV and EOS R. If you use that on those other models, it has all of those functionalities plus these two new ones. So the R6, what's different in the R6? 20.1 megapixel sensor, which it inherited from the 1DX Mark III. So if you own a 1DX Mark III, or if you've used one or have been thinking about getting one, you have a very similar sensor in this camera. So the kind of high ISO performance you get from a 1DX Mark III, you're going to get the similar performance in the EOS R6. You get 102,400 native ISO. So again, amazing high ISO performance. 4K recording up to 60 frames per second. Really incredible low light autofocus. In terms of ergonomics, the big difference between the R5 and the R6 is the R6 has a standard mode dial on the top, as opposed to that top-down LCD. So it's a little more straightforward using a mode dial. And a 300,000 rated cycle shutter. So this is the first time Canon has put a sort of professional level shutter in a camera that is not really, in terms of where it sits in our lineup, considered to be top tier professional. So this is one of the things that is really making people try and figure out which camera to get. So the big thing is the 20 megapixel difference between the 45 and the R5. But the R6, as you'll see, is an incredibly capable camera and are on par image quality wise with the 1DX Mark III. So dual card slots, these are dual UHS-2 type card slots. And so with that smaller resolution sensor, you can shoot RAW plus JPEG and get a 770 frame buffer, which is just ridiculous. There's some cards that you'll fill before you reach the buffer. So that's really great when it comes to shooting sports or any kind of fast action. You just don't need to worry about the buffer. I mentioned the incredible low light autofocus performance. The R6 will autofocus down to minus 6.5 EV. So how do I put that in realistic terms? It's basically crescent moonlight. If you're out on a clear day at night and you're lit by a crescent moon, if you're using a 1.2 lens with an R6 and the center focus point, you can expect that camera to focus in that low light scenario. And I've tested it. It really does work. It's incredible. So another big difference is the weather sealing and durability. So part of the reason that the R6 comes in at a much lower price is not just the sensor, but that it's less expensive to manufacture a body that has an outer polycarbonate body. This has that same magnesium inner body, but the outer body is polycarbonate, and it does have real weather sealing in the areas you see in the frame here. The red are actually weather sealed gaskets, but in some other areas, it's using what we're calling precision fitted parts. So there isn't any real active weather sealing in there. It's just really tightly fit parts that prevent dust and moisture from going in there. So there's no way for me to really quantify that any more than saying that it's not as weather sealed as the R5, but it's pretty good. So you combine those new cameras with the RF lenses, which we'll talk about, and we're starting to put together a really incredible, really impressive system. So we had till just last week 20 lenses in the RF lineup. Last week, we then introduced the new RF 70-200 f4 and the RF 50 millimeter 1.8. So we now have 22 lenses for this system, which is pretty incredible if you consider that it was only introduced September of 2018, so a little over 2 years ago. This is a pretty fantastic achievement for Canon for coming out with this many really high quality pieces in a new system like this. So just to point out one or two lenses in particular, the 70-200 f4 that we just introduced is incredibly small and incredibly light. You can see in the photo here, we have the EF 70-200 2.8, which I'm sure a lot of people listening right now actually have in their bags. It's sort of a staple photojournalist lens. The one in the middle is the RF version of that 2.8. So the RF 2.8 is already considerably smaller and lighter than the EF version. And now we've got the F4, which is really, think about it in terms of the size of like a 24-70 or 24-105. It really is that compact and small. So if you don't need that 2.8, you're still getting that L series durability, weather sealing, optical performance that you're used to, a really small, incredibly light package. So EF lenses, we'll talk about using them on these cameras, and it's one of the questions I get a lot. We make adapters for these, and people want to know, how do the adapters work? They work really well, and we make 3 of them. The first one is sort of just a plain Jane adapter. It converts the RF mount to the EF mount and makes those electrical contacts that it needs to make everything work. And then we've got a control ring adapter. So I talked about the new RF lenses and that programmable control ring. So the control ring adapter adds that programmable control ring functionality to any EF lens, or really any adapted lens that you put on that adapter, which is really great. So this is, sort of Canon's forward thinking with backward compatibility. We're not only allowing you to use all your old EF lenses, but we're adding functionality that those lenses didn't have when they were originally designed. And then we've got the new drop-in filter adapter. So this is a standard EF to RF adapter that accepts drop-in filters. And you can get a circular polarizer or a 9-stop variable ND. And if you're a video shooter, the ND filter is really something amazing to have that capability in a small mirrorless camera like that. I actually have the adapter here. I don't know if you can see it in my little picture, but you spin the wheel and you can run the ND down to 9 stops. Very cool. So what about performance though? This is really important. With any of these adapters, your focal length stays the same. There is no optics in the adapter to change anything about that lens that you're adapting onto that RF mount camera. So if you're shooting with a 16-35 on your 5D Mark IV and you put that on the R5, it's that exact same 16-35. Your aperture stays the same. So you're shooting with a 24-1.4, you're getting that full 1.4 aperture with any of these adapters. And most importantly, you get full speed autofocus. So adapters have tended to gotten a bad rap in the past because of two main reasons. Your number one, Canon doesn't give away sort of the secret sauce that makes our autofocus work. So third-party companies that are making adapters are having to reverse engineer our autofocus, and they can make it work, but they can't make it work like Canon makes it work. And then the other thing is that most of the time you're taking a Canon branded lens and then you're putting it on some other brand of camera. So stuff gets lost in translation between making those two systems work. So, you know, EF adapters have gotten a bad rap for those two reasons, but that's not the case with these. This is all 100% Canon, and it all actually works. And when you talk about some of our older EF lenses going all the way back to 1987 when the EF mount first came out, some of those older lenses actually perform better on our mirrorless cameras than they do on any of the DSLRs that they were designed for. So that's really important. We had a lot of RF glass and a lot of EF glass with R5 and R6 cameras at the World Series recently. People were shooting up in the rafters with 600 millimeters with teleconverters, and they were just blown away by the autofocus. So no worries with adapting any EF lenses to an RF mount camera. So to sort of wrap up the RF system, we've got the R5, we've got the R6, we've got the original EOS R, our 30 megapixel camera that came out in 2018. We've got the EOS RA. So this is a modified version of the EOS R that has a hydrogen alpha filter in front of the sensor that's used specifically for astrophotography. So this is the EOS R modified specifically for that kind of work. And then we've got the EOS RP, which is one of the smallest, lightest full frame mirrorless cameras on the market and is actually a really great little performer. So altogether, it's just a complete system that has really everything you need in terms of optics and performance and price scale and everything. It's just sort of all there. So hold your questions. I'm going to get to the C70. So this is our brand new EOS cinema camera. If any of you have used our cinema cameras in the past, the C100, 200, 300, this is a complete departure from what Canon has been doing in terms of the type of cinema camera that we're going to be making. So this is the first EOS cinema camera to use the RF mount. So all of the things that I've been talking about with the R5 and the R6, all of those great things that come along with the optics and the mechanics of that RF lens mount is now available in a cinema camera. And as you can see by the graphic here, it's sort of an in-between, C200 on the left and an EOS R on the right. And we sort of made the two of them come together to create this new RF mount cinema camera. So what's cool about this? A lot. It has a new 4K Super 35 dual gain output sensor. So if any of you are familiar with the C300 Mark III that we just announced a little while ago, this is the same sensor as in that camera with that same dual gain output that's available in the C300 Mark III. So you get 16 plus stops of dynamic range. It really is incredible, the range of tonality that this camera can capture. Again, the RF mount with the EF mount compatibility with the adapters, built-in ND filters, which we'll get to, dual mini XLRs. This is a real cinema camera set up for doing real video and real audio work. Everything you need to do really solid video is in this camera. So in terms of size, you've got it sort of up against the C200 and the 1DX Mark III. So when you look at this graphic here, you really realize how small this camera is. It's a little bit bigger than an R5 or an R6 and smaller than a 1DX Mark III. So a really incredible achievement in terms of what's in this camera and the size and form factor. I mentioned those dual XLR inputs on the side. So really high-end professional audio that you can do with this camera. You can also use a standard mic jack, a standard earphone, a USB-C terminal, which we'll talk about in a second. There's some cool things that does, a remote terminal, and of course, HDMI that's in all of our cinema cameras. So again, I can't emphasize this enough. The new RF mount and all of the great things that come with that in terms of optics and functionality are now available in the C70. All the adapters, so using all of your EF lenses on the C70 exactly the same way as the R5 or the R6, but there's now a new adapter, and a lot of people have been asking for this. So there is now a 0.71x mount adapter for the C70. We can basically call it a speed booster. Canon officially doesn't call it that, but we can call it that. And so like any other speed booster, what that does is it takes that full frame image from the EF lens and brings it down into that Super 35 sensor. And in doing that, you add an effective stop of light. So if you're shooting with an f4 lens, you're getting an effective light gathering capability of an f2.8 lens. So this is a win-win on both sides. You're getting that full frame lens that you want if you're using a wide lens or whatever, but then you're also getting that extra stop of light gathering capability. And again, it maintains all of that great dual pixel autofocus that works in all of our other cameras. The new mount adapter also includes a new mounting bracket built onto it. So specifically for the C70, you can add these dual mounting brackets on either side and basically bolt that adapter to the camera body, and you get an absolutely rigid native camera mount that's going to behave just as if that EF mount was built into the camera without any kind of wobbling or any kind of loss of optics or anything else. It's like a native speed booster mount once you add these locking brackets, which is really cool. I mentioned the ND filters. A lot of people were really skeptical whether Canon could put mechanical drop-in ND filters in a body that only has a 20 millimeter back focus distance, but the engineers at Canon have been able to do it. And so you've got these movable ND filters that will drop into the film plane and allow you to use a 1.2 lens on a bright sunny day and, you know, not blow out your images. And it really is amazing to see. If you see it the first time, you just, it's really impressive. So new slow motion capability. You get 120p up to 4K, and you get 2K up to 180p, which is really impressive. And what's new with the new high frame rate with the C70 is that you can now also record audio at the same time as doing 120 high frame rate. So that's brand new to an EOS cinema camera. So you can run your audio track separately from that high frame rate right in the camera and not have to worry about going to a separate recorder if you wanted to record that audio while you're doing that high frame rate recording. You've got dual recording media, both UHS-2 SD cards. So some people ask, why didn't you do one CF Express? Why didn't you do one SD? For full compatibility and for the frame rate that this camera is capable of, 120p at 4K, there are SD cards now that will handle that kind of throughput. So you need a V90 UHS. So moving on, dual pixel CMOS AF. So the same autofocus that you're getting in the R5 and the R6, the eye, head, and even if the subject is moved away from the camera, it will lock in on the head and maintain. So really, really impressive. You now have direct touch control on your screen. So you change different things while you're recording just by touching the rear screen, which is something that our customers have been asking for. Also, for a first in a cinema, EOS have auto ISO. So if you do a lot of run and gun work where your lighting situation is changing rapidly, you can go with that auto ISO and the camera will keep up with it, whatever lighting environment you're getting. So digital image stabilization. So this is not the mechanical in-body stabilization that I talked about with the R5 and the R6. The sensor in the C70 is fixed. It is not movable the way it is in a camera that has in-body stabilization. But when you add an RF lens that has image stabilization built into it, you still get that coordinated IS between the camera and the lens, and really impressive, very high quality stabilization with an IS enabled lens. We're not talking gimbal, but it's pretty close and really impressive. There's also additional digital IS modes where you can crop in to 2 different levels to use that outer area as additional IS functionality. And if you use the full crop in IS mode, it's really hard to tell between this camera and a full-on gimbal mounted camera. You can also do vertical video in the C70. So again, this is another new feature for a EOS cinema camera. And you actually get a tripod hole in the handle. So if you wanted to mount the camera on a tripod vertically, you have that option for doing vertical video for social media or other applications like that. I mentioned audio, the dual mini XLR inputs. So whatever you need to do in terms of audio, this camera can handle it. The remote capabilities with our RCV100 remote controller. So if the camera is set up as a remote, you have that capability with the Canon controller. And then you also have remote capability through our browser remote. So using any device that uses a standard web browser, whether it's an iPad or an iPhone or a laptop, you just sign into the camera using the IP address on the network, and you have that browser remote capability to be able to control the camera, start, stop recording, change settings, all of this stuff. I mentioned that USB-C connection. So again, a first for a EOS cinema camera. This camera will now use third-party USB-C, Wi-Fi, and Ethernet adapters. So to save space in the body and allow the engineers to make the body smaller, they just went with that USB connection and allowed third-party adapters to add that Wi-Fi or Ethernet functionality, whichever way you need it. So getting back to wrapping this up, with the new RF lenses that we talked about, combined with the EF lenses that we've been making since 1987, you've got an amazing array of lenses, including our cinema servo lenses and adapted lenses. This C70 camera can really take any kind of optic that you want to put on there. And that's it. So I thank you very much for your attention, and we'll open it up for any questions you might have.
Great. That was a really informative presentation, Tony. Thank you for that. I've got one question I see. It's from Lo. Hello, Lo. Says, hello, Mr. Tony. Are there any programs in place for students to work with Canon USA, similar to how a few other brands have student programs and ambassadors?
Hello, Lo. Hi, Lo. Specifically, what you're mentioning, it doesn't really exist in the Canon world right now in terms of having student ambassadors. But what we do have is a lot of really great relationships with a lot of the major visual schools, journalism schools, where we work with those departments and coordinate their needs. They tell us what their students need, and we help provide the gear that those students need to use for their classes. So in terms of a direct student ambassador program, I'm sorry that doesn't exist in Canon, but I will certainly request to ours. I'm not sure if that exactly answered your question, but I think it might.
All right. I was just listening as you went through your program. One of the things that excites me is the 8 stops of image stabilization when you're using the RF lenses. I guess that would be a little less when you have an adapter on for a EOS lens. Is that correct? Because if I understand it right, there's some computer information that passes between the RF lens and the bodies.
Correct. So
okay,
eight you get with certain RF lenses, you will get up to 8 stops. Not all RF lenses that have built-in IS will go up to 8 stops, and that number will vary a lot depending upon really focal length more than anything. In-lens stabilization works differently with focal length when you talk about comparing it to its effectiveness with in-body stabilization. So in-body stabilization tends to be more effective with wider focal lengths. So, 50 millimeter all the way out to super wide. And in-lens stabilization is more effective with longer focal lengths. So if you've got a 600 millimeter on an R5, it's still going to do that in-body, in-lens stabilization, but with that kind of focal length, the in-lens stabilization is going to be more effective in terms of helping you hold at a slower shutter speed. And when it comes to EF lenses or adapted Canon lenses to the RF mount, you get that combined in-body and in-lens stabilization, but because of the data throughput limitations of the EF mount, those two things are not coordinated the way they are when you have an RF lens on there. So, 5 stops, maybe 6 stops, depending upon the lens. So that number will vary with a lot of different factors, but you don't get that coordinated in-body, in-lens, where the two of them know what each other are doing and are working in conjunction to increase that stabilization. So it's a really good thing that you've got it, but the most effective way is with the RF lenses. But it's still amazing that you're getting that capability with the EF lenses.
And how would that translate to the video space? Like, could you walk with a medium to wide angle lens and have a pretty controlled, pretty stabilized image with that kind of?
Yes. So, for example, if you're shooting with our RF 24 to 105 f4 on an R5, that will give you that 8 stops of effective IS. So again, not quite gimbal, but in a lot of scenarios, really hard to tell the difference. It really is incredibly smooth hand holding these cameras for video when it comes to having that coordinated IS. It's very impressive.
Okay, I've got a few more questions here. Let's see. From Woody Marshall, he said, there has to be a downside from using DSLR. What are the downsides of switching to mirrorless?
Okay, thanks for the question, Woody. That's actually something that I get asked a lot. The advantages of the mirrorless technology, right off the bat, I talked a lot about the optics and how much better the optics are, and how we can build lenses that have specs that were not practical or even possible with the DSLR because of that moving mirror. So I mentioned the 28 to 70 f2.0. That kind of lens wouldn't really be possible or practical on a DSLR because of how big and heavy it would have to be. So that's one of the big advantages, is having that broader stable of lenses that have really impressive specifications. The other thing is just really simply just the autofocus. As good as the AF is in a Canon DX3, you're using the same device to capture the image as you are to operate that autofocus. And because of that dual pixel AF technology that we've got, the autofocus in our mirrorless cameras is significantly better than any DSLR. So especially when you're talking about not just shooting fast action where you have to track, but for example, if you're doing a portrait with an 85 millimeter 1.2 and you're shooting wide open and you're just focusing on one of the subject's eyes, you will get that eye in focus more consistently and at a higher rate than you would with the DSLR, just because of the way the mechanics of a mirrorless works, and having that technology driving it with the dual pixel AF really makes the autofocus incredibly accurate and incredibly consistent. So if you do that kind of work, mirrorless is kind of a no-brainer, because just, if you're used to getting a 70% hit on a scenario like that with a DSLR, you're up into the 90s easily with a mirrorless camera. And then you've got the smaller size, and the lighter weight. I spent most of my career carrying around 1D type cameras. They're big, they're heavy. It's nice to be able to have incredible performance in a camera body that's so small and light that, is easy to use and, sort of doesn't wear you down by the end of the day. So there's a lot of advantages to mirrorless in those regards. But then there's also people that, just like an optical viewfinder. They just prefer having that real-time view that's not coming off of an LED screen. Some photographers just find that easier and more comfortable to work with. So, by no means is DSLR dead. We're still selling a lot of 1DX Mark IIIs, even as popular as the R5 is. The 1DX Mark III sales have still kept up really impressively well. So some people still like that DSLR form factor, that optical viewfinder. So it's different strokes for different folks, but those specific things I mentioned for mirrorless, are big advantages.
Let me ask you a question from Mark Johnson. Who is one of our favorite people around here. Mark asks if there is any chance of pancake lenses in the RF mount.
Hi, Mark. So I wish I could answer that. I cannot talk about any lenses that are in development or haven't been announced, any product really. If Canon hasn't fully announced it, I'm not allowed to talk about it, whether I know about it or not. It's certainly within the realm of possibility. If you look at the new 50 millimeter 1.8 that we just announced last week, while that's not a pancake lens, if you put that on an R5, it's smaller than the EF 51.8. Like I mentioned, all of the RF lenses that have an EF counterpart tend to be smaller. So that lens is incredibly small and light. But as far as pancakes, I'm going to have to ask you to just wait and see. I can tell one thing I can say. One thing I can say that is within the realm of what Canon allows me to say is that there are some really incredibly exciting lenses coming down the pike. If you think about how many lenses came out in the EF mount since 1987, and Canon is designing the RF mount to last at least that long, think about some of the advances in technology that happened from 1987 to now, and apply that to what we're doing now with the new RF mount, and your imagination can run pretty wild.
Yeah, I saw that 28 to 70 f2. That's a pretty interesting lens to me.
Yeah.
Got a question here. Maybe we'll make this our last question from Tammy Chappelle. She wanted to know which camera and lens would be the best one for covering sports.
Hi, Tammy. Like anything else, it depends on the sport. It depends on your location. CPS has been loaning a lot of 600 and 800 millimeter lenses over the last couple of months because photographers aren't allowed on the field. So, it depends on your position in terms of focal length. The 300-2.8 has always been sort of a staple sports lens for indoor and outdoor. And as I mentioned, with the EF lenses performing so well on the R5 and R6, that's a great lens to go with. Our 200-400 is sort of, the best sports lens ever made with a built-in 1.4 converter. It's incredibly popular for sports. And one thing I didn't mention, thank you, Tammy, for bringing up the question. One of the things that sports photographers have sort of figured out with the R5 that really didn't dawn on me initially when we first introduced it is that the R5 has a 1.6x crop mode in it. So you can shoot full frame at 45 megapixels, but then you can also set the camera for a 1.6 APS-C crop mode that delivers a 17 megapixel file, which is really more than enough for most applications. So when I talk about, photographers shooting up from the rafters with a 600 millimeter, being able to enable that 1.6 crop mode in the R5 with a 600, it gives you an effective 960 millimeter focal length, but you don't lose a stop like you would if you put a 1.4 converter on. So if you're shooting a game at night, you've still got that full f4 and a 17 megapixel file. So that's also really impressive.
That is amazing. Technology.
Yeah, that was I got a text from one of the Getty sports photographers one night, and he's like, "I just found this crop mode. This thing is incredible. Why didn't you tell me about it?" And in all honesty, I hadn't really thought about applying it in that way. But in terms of sports and needing a long lens, the R5 really delivers with that crop mode.
Wow. All right, Tony. Well, I think it's time to wrap it up. We really enjoyed your presentation, and we certainly appreciate your Canon support of the seminar. We hope people continue to get a lot out of this year. We have an incredible lineup coming up. And so next up, we have Mick with Photo Mechanic, Mick Orlowski. I'm not sure if we're going to a break or if we're going to go straight in here.
Well, if I've got a second, I want to thank you all in the Atlanta Photojournalism Seminar for having me. Some of you might remember me in Atlanta last year. I was there. Photojournalism is the world that I come from. It's something that is incredibly important to me and is also incredibly important to Canon. And we really put a lot of resources and a lot of interest into supporting the photojournalism community. It's a really important segment of the market for us at Canon. So absolutely, we will support in any way we can, and I'm really happy to be here this year. So thank you.